Welcome to Basic Black. This is our 50th anniversary year, and we are convening all kinds of conversations to support the rich history that is Basic Black, the program. Today, a special Facebook Live. I'm here with Andrea Ritchie, who is a police misconduct attorney with more than 20 years of experience as a researcher, a policy analyst, and advocate on criminal justice issues. But more importantly, right here is her new book called Invisible No More: Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color. And I'm holding up the cover, Andrea, because underneath the title, which you spelled out very well, is a woman holding a poster. And the poster says, "Black women, girls, trans folks get locked up and shot down too," which is the essence of your book. So, and that's to remind us, or to make us aware that when we think about police violence, we don't think of women and girls.
We don't. So Invisible No More is a book that looks at issues of racial profiling, police violence, mass incarceration, all of which have been very much a subject of conversation over the past few years, but through the lens of women's experiences, which is not generally how we look at those issues. And what it shows is what the sign says, is that if we look where we're already looking in terms of who's getting stopped, who's getting locked up, who's getting shot down, if we look more closely there, we will start to see women and trans and gender nonconforming people being killed by police or arrested and stopped. And then also if we start to look in the places that we're not already looking, like, for instance, we're having a national conversation now around sexual violence under the hashtag #MeToo. If we start looking at sexual violence by police officers, then we're going to start to see a lot more stories of women emerge. If we look at how police are involved in child welfare enforcement, then we're going to start to see a lot more stories about women. If we look in the policing of prostitution, where we don't usually think about that as a place where racial profiling happens, or if we're thinking about racial profiling, that's not what we're thinking about. If we start looking, we'll see that there's significant racial profiling that happens in the context of policing of prostitution or even policing of domestic violence. So it's a book about both what we're already talking about and the things that we're not talking about yet.
Now, some of the names that and stories that you tell in this book I was familiar with. Rekia Boyd, I'm familiar with. And a couple other ones, but many, many more I was not. So you have about 300 stories of women here. I think what's really important, speaking to the point of your not seeing, or our not seeing, I'm taking a case like Eric Garner. If you were to mention his name, that's the gentleman who was in New York selling the single cigarettes on the street. The police officer put him in a chokehold. He said, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." That became a national cry, "I can't breathe." And of course he died. Right around the same time, you note that there were women who were involved in similar situations. I wonder if you would share that story. I mean, it was shocking that it was happening at the same time, but yet we never heard it.
Right, so the story that happened around the same time as Eric Garner was a woman named Roseanne Miller, and police approached her similarly around a minor offense, part of this sort of broken windows policing that New York is so famous for, that spread around the country, where police officers just harassed people about selling loose cigarettes, and in her case about barbecuing in front of her own house. And she was 7 months pregnant, and when she questioned the officer's right to tell her what to do in front of her own house in terms of barbecuing, he put her in a chokehold. Thankfully, she lived to tell the tale, which may be part of the reason that we don't know about it. But the other is because, yeah, she was a woman, and she was 7 months pregnant, and it happened in front of her 2-year-old daughter. She was an immigrant from the Caribbean, and you know, it's just those stories don't register in the same way. At the same time, or the same year, a woman named Alicia Thomas was killed in the backseat of a LAPD cruiser by an officer, and she also, you can hear her on tape saying that she can't breathe as the officer's kicking her and abusing her. And again, sort of that very compelling story and audio is something that, when it happens to women, somehow doesn't register in the same way, doesn't resonate in the same way. And so the hope with this book is to, if I tell enough stories, then maybe they'll start to register and we'll start to see them in the same kind of iconic way, and it'll start to inform and shape the conversation.
Now, we've noted that you've been doing this work for more than 20 years, but what was it that began your journey of really trying to document what you have put in this book?
So it was around the time that the Rodney King beating happened, and then the first acquittal of the officers who beat him in the 90s. Around that time, there were a number of stories that were surfacing in Toronto, where I was living at the time. Most notably, a black Jamaican woman who was standing on a street corner at 1 in the morning, and the officers approached her and proceeded to essentially strip search her publicly on the street corner after telling her that she just looked like a drug dealer, which there was nothing about her that looked like a drug dealer other than that she was black and standing on a street corner. And then as we were sort of investigating and organizing around that case, many, many more similar cases started to come to light. And somehow, me and the community of black women who were organizing around these cases, we were talking about them, but everyone else was only talking about Rodney King. And so there just was a disconnect for me. And so I felt like, oh, well, clearly maybe people don't know enough about these cases, and that's why they're not talking about them. So I started documenting them. And then over time, it became clear that it wasn't just that people didn't know about the cases, it was that there's this sort of intractable notion that police violence is something that happens to black men, and domestic violence and private violence is something that happens to white women, and black women and women of color who experience both kinds of violence are sort of left out in the cold. And so that then kind of became, I have to say, a bit of an obsession or a mission to change that, and so that's what produced this book.
One of the things that you also raise in this book, and again the book is Invisible No More, Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color, is that this is a long history. I'm reading examples from 1945 in Memphis, Tennessee, which without the trappings of the time could be set in today's time.
Absolutely, and there's even, you can go back even further than that. Sarah Haley is a historian who's done some incredible work of archival work, and Talitha LaFleury is another, who look at the experiences of black women right after emancipation, and how as soon as black women were no longer enslaved, the job of the police was to put them right back into the homes of the people who they had just left, and to put them back into domestic service and servitude. And so they would arrest them on the street for being too loud, for being drunk and disorderly, for being out after dark, and assuming that they were engaged in prostitution, and would treat them in ways that are just very similar to the ways you see black women being treated by police today. And those stories as well were stories that people like Cynthia Blair have documented around policing of black women on the south side of Chicago, and the assumptions that they were all engaged in prostitution, or the ways in which people who were engaged in prostitution, because that was the only way to make a living other than domestic servitude, the way they were treated by police is just very similar to the kinds of things that we see today. So I also felt important to talk about the ways in which indigenous women have also been policed as part of the colonization of this land from 1492 to the present. And I was finishing the book last summer in the midst of Standing Rock, and it just was such a poignant reminder that the colonization of this land has always been and come at the cost of violence at the hands of the state against Native women and young girls. And it was happening again as I was finishing up the book. So it's been kind of a continuous thread throughout history.
So the stories that you share have been alternately described as raw, terrifying, haunting, horrific, and their overall violent interactions. I wonder if there's one that stands out for you. And I want to make the point that you make the point. You're not putting the stories in here in all of their graphic detail as some kind of tragic porn. It's not for our excitement, but it's just to make clear that people understand exactly what we're talking about. You're not speaking in generalities.
Right, I'm not trying to euphemize or paper it over or cover it over, but I'm also not trying to reproduce it when telling the story. So it was a delicate balance, and I often wonder if I strike it well enough. It's really hard to pull out one story because there are so many. And so I think the ones that continue to stand out for me are the ones that I learned of first, right? Mm-hmm. So Eleanor Bumpers, who in 1984 was being evicted from her public housing unit because she was behind on her rent that was like less than $100 a month. And she's an elderly woman, she's partially blind, she's disabled, she's has some mental health issues, and the ways in which the police officers just shot her dead in her own home and carried her out. Audre Lorde wrote a poem about it, right? Just sort of carried her out in front of her neighbors, half naked, and just the complete disrespect with which they treated an elder who was struggling. And just wondering, if her case had been iconic in the same ways that Rodney King's became, would we not only be talking about driving while black, but would we also be talking about what it's like to live while elderly and poor and disabled and female? So that one strikes me. I think that a lot of cases of the young 5-year-old who I remember seeing being handcuffed on a video in the 90s, I remember thinking, what are these adults thinking? they're handcuffing a 5-year-old who threw a temper tantrum. I mean, every 5-year-old has thrown a temper tantrum, and by the time the police showed up, she was sitting on a couch quietly, and the handcuffs were too big to put on her wrists. And so they put them on her upper arms. And I just thought, what is going through the minds of these police officers that they're arresting this child? And I think that was when I realized how deep the controlling narratives are about black women and girls, how deeply the perceptions are that no matter how small, no matter how tiny, no matter how helpless, no matter how much in need of help, no matter how non-threatening they are perceived as threatening.
And to be clear, they wouldn't have put the handcuffs on a non-white 5-year-old.
No, on a white 5-year-old, there's no way. No way. And not only that, but the Supreme Court just recently ruled that police officers, if they can't put the handcuffs on the wrists of children, that they can't then put them on their upper arms. I mean, this is 15 years later they ruled this. I mean, I couldn't, it took them 15 years to say that. So those kinds of things shock me, I think. There's so many videos of police officers slamming women around that just every time get me in the gut and cause me to gasp and burst into tears. And so Sandra Bland's story, I think, hit a lot of women, black women particularly, because all of us have not used a turn signal. All of us might have pulled over quickly to get out of the way of a police officer. All of us who have smoked cigarettes in our lives might have said, "Why do I have to put my cigarette out?" And I think what strikes me often is just how common and just how commonplace it is, right? And so recently when the Attorney General of Florida was pulled over by police and racially profiled, I just think it's just so indicative of how commonplace it is and yet how invisible.
The Attorney General, who was a black woman, just to be clear.
Yes, sorry.
So
obviously.
I just want to make people might not understand it. And if we were talking about commonplace, both of us have had police interactions.
Right.
I was a student at Wellesley College in the takeout line of Burger King with my girlfriend, and we were scared to death, didn't know why the police were investigating us. Well, it turned out there was a break from the Framingham prison. So any black woman outside, we're in Wellesley, Massachusetts.
Right.
Okay. So just to let you know that I'm understanding that this is I know clearly how a Sandra Bland situation could escalate. One of the stunning things for me in your book is to talk about the policy that does not exist in the police departments, because your book is focused on police policy, violence, interaction with women of color and black women, that there is no policy that says that the police cannot are forbidden from sexual misconduct with members of the public. Now, they are with their fellow employees. In fact, our Boston chief was just on our air this week talking about stirring up a refresher course for his men about how they're to act in the marketplace because of what's happening in the current conversation. But I wouldn't have known prior to your book that there is no policy about how they behave outside of that framework. Please speak to that.
Including in Boston.
Yes,
so Boston was
that,
one of the cities that I surveyed. I looked at the 38 of the top 50 police departments in the country who either responded to a survey I sent or had publicly available policies online. And less than half had any kind of policy saying, as a police officer, you can't sexually harass young women as they're walking to school. You can't sexually assault young women as you're stopping and frisking them. And you can't, have sex with someone in the back of a police car. You can't extort sex from someone in exchange for letting them go. Policies, most police departments don't have a policy that says that. Despite the fact that the International Association of Chiefs of Police put out a guidance in 2011 to police departments telling them that they needed to create those kinds of policies. And then in light of the failure of most departments to follow that guidance, a recommendation of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, the former President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, that departments needed to do this, and the recommendation of the Department of Justice, the former Department of Justice, that departments need to do this. And they're still not doing it, even in this moment of heightened awareness and conversation around sexual violence. And then in Chicago, where the Department of Justice investigation discovered this to be a problem and recommended that people be given somewhere to go other than the police to report sexual violence by the police.
Right.
And so legislators tried to pass some legislation saying, okay, you can take that to a civilian oversight agency, you don't have to take that to the police. And the police union blocked it. So I think that starts to give us a bit of an answer about why there aren't policies, and even where there are policies, where they're not effectively enforced, and that needs to change.
I was reminded that about this time last year, I was doing a piece about Daniel Holtzclaw, who was the Oklahoma police officer who had assaulted any number of women in and out of his custody, was only found out because the woman that he pulled over, a grandmother, turned him in, even though he threatened her life. Afterwards, she turned him in. And I was struck by the quote by the 17-year-old that he assaulted, in which she said, what kind of police do you go to talk about the police, to get help from the police? And that's just so incredibly poignant. But people need to know that there is no policy about that.
Right, there's no policy, and then also we're not taking steps to prevent it. I think one thing that I find frustrating about this moment, and just to your story, I mean, every time I hear those stories, I'm enraged and frustrated, right, and on your behalf, and I'm really sorry that that happened to you. But, and I'm enraged every time I hear these stories around police sexual violence, but I'm also frustrated that we kind of, react with outrage, wring our hands, and treat each one like they're kind of a case-by-case problem instead of looking at them as the epidemic, as symptoms of the epidemic that police sexual violence is. So it's not just about policies and accountability on the back end, it's about preventing it on the front end. And so we need to look at officers like Holtzclaw, who were unique only in that he got caught and convicted,
That's right?
Yeah. But his patterns and his targets are very symptomatic of what happens across the country. So he targeted low-income women, young women, women who he believed were involved in the sex trades, women he believed were involved in the drug trade, and women during traffic stops and domestic violence calls. Those are the women who get targeted across the country, and so we need to look at what kinds of policing policies are enabling that to happen. So broken windows policing gives officers almost unlimited power to stop women, to threaten them with tickets of various kinds, everything from disorderly conduct to on up. The war on drugs gives officers license to, in their minds, maybe not under the law and the Constitution, but in their minds, to walk up to women like Holtzclaw used to do and say, lift up your shirt, prove to me you're not hiding drugs. To the grandmother, he said, drop your pants, prove to me you're not hiding drugs. And then if you don't do what I'm going to tell you to do, you could be facing one of these mandatory minimums that Jeff Sessions is really ramping up. You could do 25 years over whatever tiny amount of drugs I might find on you. So you can do that and lose your house, your kids, your family, your job, your life, or you could do what I'm going to demand of you. And I feel like we need to look at the things that give officers power over women like that, and the ways in which they work, like Holtzclaw did, in isolation, alone, at night, and correct those things. Because unless we address those things, the policies themselves are only pieces of paper, unless we actually do something to stop it on the front end.
So this is a tough book. It's got really hard stories to read, but very powerful, because these women's stories really come through very powerfully, thanks to you. So what do you say to people who say, I'm listening to you, Andrea Ritchie, I believe you, I think this is an important conversation, probably even more important in this at this particular time while we're having another big public conversation, but it's so disconnected from my life. How do you say to those people why they should care?
It's probably not that disconnected from your life. And I think one of the messages of this book is that women like you and I and so many thousands of others have had these experiences and never talked about them. Because there's never really been a space to, right? When there's a conversation happening about police violence, the main subjects are men. When there's a conversation happening about sexual violence, the main subjects are women, celebrities, Congress interns. And none of those conversations make room for us. So one, it's probably not that disconnected. And if you start making room in your life, in your organization, in your church group, in your community to hear these stories, they will start to come forward. And you will find that you are probably connected to a woman who's had one of these experiences, to start there. And then secondly, we're all responsible for each other's safety. And so if the stories in the book disturb you, I hope that spurs you to action and to do any number of things in your community to try and not just make them more visible, but also prevent them from happening in the future.
One of the things that you've done in terms of your research and policy work was to work with Kimberly Crenshaw, who created the concept of intersectionality on a report about Say Her Name, which was really to get people to say the name of these women because they don't get articulated. I wonder if you'd speak a little bit about that, as maybe that's something that people can do in their everyday lives, and what other things, because it feels very hard to figure out how do you stop or prevent the kind of certainly police violence, state-sanctioned violence that's happening to these women in this book.
I think you're right that the first thing you can do is just talk about it. And I think that's one of the things I wrote the book for, is to be a resource for people to start to talk about it. I think Say Her Name originated because Kimberly Crenshaw and members of the African American Policy Forum were marching in support of Eric Garner, and as people were chanting the names of men who had experienced police violence, they were chanting the names of women, and no one was picking up those chants, and no one knew who they were talking about, and no one knew the pictures of the women on the banner they were carrying. So I think at the very beginning, just making it visible is important, and we need to move beyond visibility. And I think that it can feel daunting, but everyone, again, it has some kind of connection to it, right? So there may be police officers in your kid's school or in your community's school, and they may be engaging in behavior like we saw on video last year when the young woman was pulled out of her chair by a police officer, dragged across the floor, or they might be arresting young women or sexually harassing them. Find out about what the police officers are doing in your community school. That's one place you can start, and how they're affecting young women. Find out how police officers respond to mental health crises. Find out what they're doing when they're responding to domestic violence. Find out what policing of prostitution in your neighborhood, in your community, in your city looks like, and how much racial profiling and racial disparity there is there, and how much police violence there is that's happening there. I think that no matter what your area of interest, whether it's your kids' education, your neighborhood, you can go to your community precinct council and ask, how are you making sure that police officers are not sexually harassing women in our community? What are you doing to do that? You can go to the public forum with the police chief and ask him what he's doing about it. How is the community making sure that you engage LGBT people in a way that's respectful of their rights and dignity? Talk about it at your workplace, talk about your church group, talk about it in your reading group. I think we can move beyond visibility to action wherever we are. Wherever you are, there's something that you can do to address these issues.
How do we link what is happening in this current public conversation that mostly, I have to say, has focused on white women, and prominent white women on top of that. So it's mostly that, and not it, and that for black women, with the exception of Lupita Nyong'o, who admittedly has a privileged position, but she came out and immediately was attacked by Harvey Weinstein.
Exactly.
But the voices of black women and other women of color have almost been lost in this huge, gigantic conversation we're having, even though there's a little tiny now paying attention to low-wage workers and what's been happening to them. I wonder if there are ways that you can articulate that there can be linkages right now while we're in this moment so that this doesn't get lost again.
Absolutely. To say, because we're looking at how men in positions of power abuse that power. Well, who has more power in our communities than police officers? They're armed, they have the power to arrest, they have the power to charge you with something that can change your entire life, and they have the power, frankly, to harm you and kill you. So if we're looking at how men exercise power to extort sex from women, to sexually harass women, to rape women, and silence them about the sexual violence they're experiencing, there's no better group of people than police officers to look at. It's like Boston here is the home of uncovering the scandal around abuses in the Catholic Church. Well, it's a similar systemic problem, and it's a similar systemic sort of cover-up in the sense that, they're people who work one-on-one with people in isolation and don't have a lot of supervision and are protected by a code of silence. So I think that we need to insist that we're going to talk about the women who are most vulnerable to sexual violence, who are least able to come forward, and who are most at risk, and both of the violence itself and of retaliation, and insist on having that be part of the conversation. So I appreciate you for raising it, I appreciate you for giving it the time on your show, and I encourage journalists and other media makers to do the same, and celebrities, but also community members and folks who care about this issue and want to make sure that there's room for the women who are experiencing sexual violence under the conditions that are most threatening and most challenging.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
The book is Invisible No More, Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color. Our guest is Andrea Ritchie. She's a police conduct attorney with more than 20 years experience looking at these issues through policy and research and advocacy. And I thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.